The stars over the Talaran system shone like cold, distant lights. But to the refugees gathered near the edge of the dying sun, they felt more like the last candles before darkness. Their fleet floated silently in the emptiness, broken ships drifting together in a loose formation, their engines weak and their shields barely holding. These ships were not built for war. They were civilian transports, old freighters, hospital vessels, and colony carriers, each one crowded with families, wounded soldiers, and frightened children. For weeks they had been running from the Varkesh, a cruel and powerful enemy that enjoyed hunting weaker targets. The Varkesh were not just conquerors, they were predators, and this corner of space had become their hunting ground. Inside the largest refugee ship, the Celarith, the atmosphere was tense. The control room smelled of burned circuits and stale air, because the ventilation system had been running far beyond its limit. Technicians moved between broken consoles, trying to squeeze a few more hours of power out of failing reactors every few minutes. The comms officer reported that another ship had lost engine function, or that another power conduit had blown. It was a slow collapse, like watching sand slip through fingers. The enemy fleet was closing in from behind, their ships appearing as sharp glowing dots on the radar. Each red dot represented a vessel designed for war, fast, armored, and armed with weapons powerful enough to tear through the refugees' hulls in seconds. There was no way the refugees could outrun them anymore. Their engines were failing, and the nearest friendly system was too far away. Everyone knew it. This was the end of the road. In the medical bays, injured passengers lay in rows. Wrapped in thin blankets, doctors and nurses worked quietly, not because everything was under control, but because they knew panic would only make things worse. Mothers whispered stories to their children, pretending everything was fine, though their eyes gave away the truth. Old men stared at the ceiling, their faces tired from years of war and loss. A heavy silence filled every corner of the ship, the kind of silence that comes when people run out of hope. On the bridge, the Teleran Council gathered. These were the leaders of the different alien races who had banded together to escape the Varkesh. Their faces showed different emotions: anger, fear, exhaustion, but they all understood the situation. One council member, a tall insectoid named Velen, slammed his claw against the table, demanding that they fight back. Better to die with honor than to drift like prey, he hissed, his mandibles clicking with frustration. Another council member, an elderly amphibian named Laura, shook her head slowly, her voice trembling. Our ships are unarmed. Our shields are weak. Our engines are dying. A charge would only bring faster death, she said. The argument went back and forth, some shouting for a last stand, others whispering about surrender. The captain of the Celarith, a calm and stern alien named Saral, stood quietly as the council argued. She had seen too many battles, too many desperate endings. She knew their weapons couldn't stop the Varkesh fleet, but she also couldn't bring herself to surrender. She walked over to the main screen and watched the enemy dots get closer and closer. Her mind raced through possibilities, but every strategy ended the same way, with destruction. Across the fleet, similar scenes played out. Pilots checked their weapons even though they had almost nothing left. Civilians clutched keepsakes from their homeworlds. Whispering prayers to forgotten gods, children pressed their faces to the viewports, watching the enemy ships grow larger like approaching storms. Every passing minute felt like the tightening of a noose. In the engineering bay, a group of young technicians tried one last time to boost the shields. They rerouted power from the artificial gravity to the shields, causing the floors to tilt and people to float slightly. No one complained, they all understood why. If the shields could last even a few more minutes, maybe, just maybe, they could survive long enough for a miracle. But miracles were rare in this part of space. The Varkesh fleet began sending messages. Cold and cruel, they did not offer mercy, only demands for surrender and promises of quick deaths. Their language was sharp, each word like a blade. The messages were broadcast to every ship, even the civilian channels, so that everyone could hear the enemy's confidence. Fear spread quickly, like a shadow moving through the corridors. Some passengers began to cry quietly, while others held each other in silence. A few brave souls started preparing escape pods. Though everyone knew they were useless in deep space, there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The Teleran sun, now unstable and glowing violently, provided no shelter, only a deadly background for their last moments. The star's surface flared with bright waves of energy, casting long, eerie shadows inside the ships. The Cellerith sent out one final distress beacon, a weak signal into the void. They didn't expect anyone to hear it. Their allies were too far away. Human space was even farther, and most people had abandoned this region years ago. Still, Saral ordered the beacon to be sent, her voice steady but her heart heavy. It was not a call for rescue, but a final act of defiance, a whisper into the endless dark. As the Varkesh ships entered weapons range, the alarms on every refugee ship began to sound. The red emergency lights flashed, casting everything in a harsh glow. Children screamed, officers shouted orders, and engines strained as pilots tried to hold formation. The first enemy shots had not yet been fired, but everyone could feel it coming. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to give way. In that moment, many believed it was over. They thought no one would come, no one would hear their call. The refugees braced themselves for the inevitable, their ships trembling in the dark, and then, just before the first enemy salvo, space itself began to ripple. Something was coming. But they didn't know what yet. For now, all they could do was wait, hearts pounding, as the desperate stand reached its peak. Far away from the Telleran system, in the deep and quiet stretches of space where no colonies existed and no trade ships traveled, the human patrol ship UNS Resolute moved slowly through the dark. It was a huge gray vessel built for long missions far from home, its surface covered in thick armor and sensor arrays that scanned every direction. Inside, the ship was calm but alive with quiet activity. Crew members walked through brightly lit corridors, some carrying data tablets, others adjusting controls on the walls. They had been on patrol for weeks, sweeping through this forgotten part of the galaxy to check for smugglers, lost ships, or strange signals. Most of the time, they found nothing, only empty space and the faint hum of the engines. On the bridge, Commander Hale sat in the captain's chair, staring at the main screen. He was a man with sharp eyes and a steady presence. Respected by his crew, his patrol had been uneventful so far, just like the dozens before it. But Hale believed in the importance of these missions. Even when nothing happened, he often said, "The void may look empty, but it's full of secrets," and everyone on the ship knew he meant it. The bridge crew worked in silence until a small beep broke through the calm. The communications officer, a young woman named Liara, frowned and leaned over her console. "Sir, I'm picking up something strange," she said. The others turned toward her station. "It's a signal, very weak. Old frequency," she added, adjusting the controls to clear the static. The sound that came through was faint, almost like a whisper through broken speakers. The room grew tense as the officers leaned closer to listen. Liara filtered the signal and slowly a clear pattern emerged. It wasn't random noise, it was a distress beacon. Hale stood up and walked over, his boots echoing on the metal floor. "Where is it coming from?" he asked. She hesitated, double-checking the readings. "Telleran sector, sir. Near the dying star," she said, surprised. Everyone on the bridge exchanged glances. That sector had been abandoned for years, considered too unstable and too far to protect. No human ship had patrolled there in a long time. "Can you get the exact coordinates?" Hale asked, his voice calm but firm. Liara nodded. "Yes, sir, but the signal is fading. It must be coming from a damaged transmitter, maybe decades old." The navigator pulled up a star map marking the location of the signal. It was deep in what most humans called the silent zone, a place rarely visited except by explorers or desperate refugees. There were no colonies, no supply routes, no nearby reinforcements. Some of the officers looked uneasy. "Sir, that area's practically dead space," one of them said. "No one's supposed to be out there," another added. "If it's a trap, we'd be the only ones around to walk into it." Hale listened to them quietly, but his eyes remained fixed on the star map. He had a gut feeling, the kind that experienced commanders learn to trust. This wasn't a trap, it was something else, something that didn't fit the usual patterns. He finally turned to the crew, his voice steady. "Set a course for Telleran sector." The navigator blinked. "Sir, that's a 5-hour jump, and we'd be way outside our assigned patrol range." "I'm aware," Hale replied. "But someone out there is calling for help, and if we don't go, no one will." There was a moment of silence. Then the navigator nodded and began inputting the jump coordinates. Engines powered up with a deep rumble that spread through the ship like a heartbeat. Down in the engineering bay, crew members prepared the Alcubierre drive for the long jump. Giant coils hummed with energy as the ship's core reached the required power levels. The chief engineer, an older man named Brooks, wiped sweat from his forehead and grinned. "Looks like we're going on an adventure," he said to his team. They laughed nervously, knowing that long jumps into uncharted regions could be dangerous. The Alcubierre drive worked by bending space itself, allowing the ship to cover huge distances in a short time. It was powerful, but once they jumped, turning back quickly would not be easy. As preparations continued, Hale stood by the observation window, looking out into the endless darkness. He had commanded the Resolute for years, and he had seen many strange things in deep space. But something about this faint distress signal stirred something inside him. It was almost like a voice calling from the past, weak but determined. He thought about the people who might be sending it. Stranded travelers, maybe a lost colony ship, or survivors from an old battle, whoever they were. They had held on long enough for their signal to reach him. Before the jump, Hale gathered his senior officers in the briefing room. The lights dimmed as the star map appeared on the wall, showing their current position and the target location. "The Telleran sector is unstable," Hale began. "It's near a dying star. Gravitational waves can interfere with sensors, and the Varkesh are known to operate in nearby regions." He let the weight of his words settle in. "This will not be a routine mission. We're going in blind, and if something goes wrong, no one's close enough to help us." The officers exchanged serious looks, but no one objected. They knew their commander well, and they trusted him. The moment arrived. The ship entered jump mode. Outside, space seemed to stretch and fold as the drive engaged. Inside, everything vibrated slightly, lights dimming for a moment before stabilizing. The Resolute shot through warped space like a spear, leaving normal reality behind. During the jump, the crew prepared for any possibility. Tactical teams checked their railgun systems. Pilots ran diagnostics on fighter drones. Medics prepared the infirmary. No one knew what awaited them at the end of the jump, but the atmosphere shifted from calm routine to focused determination. Even the youngest crew members sensed it. This mission felt different. Commander Hale sat alone for a moment in his quarters, looking at a small photograph of Earth. It reminded him why humanity explored the stars, why they didn't ignore distant cries for help. He whispered softly, "Hold on, whoever you are," as if the refugees could hear him across the void. As the countdown reached 0, the Resolute prepared to drop out of warp. The stars ahead flickered strangely, as if space itself was warning them. The crew tightened their grips on consoles and harnesses, hearts beating faster. They had followed a ghost signal into the unknown, not knowing that what waited on the other side would change everything. Aboard the alien flagship Celerith, the situation was growing worse by the minute. The bridge was crowded with officers, engineers, and council members from different species, all talking over each other, their voices filled with fear and frustration. The air inside the ship felt heavy, as if the walls themselves understood what was coming. Every screen showed the same thing: the enemy fleet, the Varkesh moving closer in a tight and deadly formation. Red warning lights flashed around the room, and the low hum of failing machinery echoed through the corridors. The Celerith had once been a proud exploration vessel, designed for peaceful missions between distant star systems. Now, it was serving as the command center for a desperate coalition of alien refugees. Its engines were damaged, its shields were weak, and its weapon systems were limited. Around it floated dozens of other ships, transports, freighters, medical carriers, and none of them made for war together. They looked less like a fleet, and more like a collection of wounded birds, circling helplessly in the dark. On the main screen, the Varkesh fleet appeared as sharp glowing symbols. Closing in from behind, they moved like hunters, surrounding their prey slowly, without rushing, because they knew the refugees had nowhere to go. The enemy ships were perfectly organized, their formation tightening like a net, ready to crush anything trapped inside. Everyone on the Celerith could feel it. The moment of contact was near. In the council chamber, which had been temporarily converted into a war room, the leaders of the refugee coalition gathered around a large holographic table. The table displayed a 3D map of the system, showing the refugee ships in blue and the enemy fleet in red. The red markers were multiplying, new enemy ships jumping in to join the hunt. The blue markers, on the other hand, were slowly disappearing as some refugee vessels lost power and drifted out of formation. Unable to keep up, voices rose as the debate grew more intense. Velen, the tall insectoid council member, slammed one of his sharp claws against the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "They are coming," He hissed. "We should attack now. Use every engine, every weapon, strike before they crush us." A smaller, nervous-looking avian leader shook his head, feathers trembling. "Attack? With what? We have no weapons to match theirs." Another council member, a reptilian elder with deep scars on his face, spoke slowly. "Perhaps we should surrender. At least then some may survive." His words were met with instant shouting, some agreeing, others furious at the idea. Captain Saral, the commander of the Kellerith, stood near the edge of the room, listening carefully. Her expression was calm, but inside, she felt the weight of every life in the fleet pressing on her shoulders. She had been a captain for many years, but never had she faced something like this. No reinforcements, no escape route, and an enemy determined to destroy them. She walked toward the table, her steps steady, and raised her hand. Signaling for silence slowly, the arguing voices died down, leaving only the hum of the failing generators in the background. "We do not have the firepower to win a direct fight," Saral said plainly, her voice firm but not cruel. "But surrendering to the Varkesh will not save us either," she continued. "They have shown time and again that they take no prisoners. They destroy everything, they erase entire worlds." The room fell silent, the truth cutting through the fear like a blade. Everyone knew what she said was true. The Varkesh were known for their cruelty, for turning defeated populations into nothing more than ash and memory. One of the younger council members, a soft-spoken amphibian, asked quietly, "Then what do we do?" Saral looked at the map on the table, the red dots closing in. "We hold as long as we can," she said. "We keep the fleet together, keep the shields running, and make them fight for every inch of space." Her words were not a promise of victory, but they carried something the others needed. Direction, a reason to keep going for a moment. The fear in the room turned into determination, weak but real. Meanwhile, in the engineering sections of the refugee ships, crews worked tirelessly to keep their vessels operational. On the Cellerith, a team of exhausted engineers was gathered around a cracked shield generator, sparks flying as they tried to stabilize it. "We can give you 40% power for maybe 20 minutes, one engineer said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "After that, the generator will melt. Then we'll make those 20 minutes count," his supervisor replied, tightening a loose cable. They knew their work might only delay the inevitable, but none of them were willing to give up yet. On the decks of the smaller ships, civilians prepared in different ways. Some gathered in prayer halls, whispering to their gods or ancestors, asking for a miracle. Others sat quietly holding loved ones, staring at the stars through the viewports knowing this might be their last sight. A few young pilots volunteered to fly tiny escort fighters. Even though their chances of survival were close to zero, they simply wanted to protect their people for as long as they could. Back on the bridge, alarms beeped as new data came in. The enemy fleet had entered attack range, their forward weapons powering up. The radar showed waves of missiles being armed and cannons charging. The refugees had little to respond with. A few outdated defense turrets and improvised barriers. Their final line of defense was weak, but it was all they had. Saral took a deep breath and gave her orders. "All ships, hold formation. Focus shields on the forward sectors. Keep the transports behind the Cellerith." Her voice was calm and clear, carrying across the fleet's comms, giving structure to chaos. Pilots adjusted their positions, captains rerouted power. Engineers diverted energy from life support to shields. The fleet tightened its formation like a wounded animal preparing to defend itself. In that tense moment, time seemed to slow down. The refugee fleet floated in the darkness, cornered and exhausted, while the Varkesh fleet closed in like wolves circling their prey. Every person on board knew that the next hour would decide their fate. Some whispered their goodbyes, others clenched their fists, waiting for the enemy's first strike. No one knew that far away. A human ship was racing toward them through the void, following their weak signal. But for now, they stood on the edge of annihilation, united by desperation and the faint, fading hope that something might change. The moment came quietly at first, like the calm before a massive storm. The refugee fleet floated in the darkness, shields flickering weakly, engines failing, and the enemy ships slowly surrounding them like a tightening trap. On the bridge of the Cellerith, the warning lights flashed red, signaling that the Varkesh weapons were fully charged. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the first deadly volley to strike. The sound of alarms filled the air and officers shouted orders over the comms, trying to keep their ships in formation despite broken engines and fading power. Then something strange happened. A sudden ripple appeared in the void, far beyond the edge of the system. At first, the sensors couldn't explain it. It looked like empty space bending in on itself, as if invisible hands were pulling it apart. The navigational officer on the Solarith stared at the screen, confused. "Captain, there's something out there," he said slowly. Captain Soral turned to look at the display, her eyes narrowing. The ripple grew larger, spreading like a wave through the blackness, distorting the stars around it. The Varkesh noticed it too. Their ship slowed slightly, their formation pausing for the first time. The enemy fleet was known for being cold and precise. They didn't hesitate, but this sudden disturbance made even them cautious. One of their cruisers scanned the anomaly, sending out beams of energy that scattered uselessly against the rippling void. They didn't know what was coming, and neither did the refugees. A blinding flash burst from the center of the ripple, lighting up the dark space like a small sun. Some of the refugee pilots covered their eyes instinctively. Others shouted over the comms in panic, thinking it was some new weapon. But as the light faded, a shape began to emerge, large, metallic, sharp-edged. It wasn't an enemy ship. It was something else entirely. The refugees leaned closer to their viewports, trying to make sense of the massive figure forming in front of them. The shape resolved into a gigantic human warship, gray and powerful, its armor plates gleaming faintly under the distant light of the dying star. Its name was written boldly along the side, UNS Resolute. For a second, the bridge of the Solarith went completely silent. No one spoke, no one moved. Many of the refugees had only heard stories about human warships, powerful vessels that rarely entered conflicts beyond their own territories. Some believed humans were selfish, staying out of galactic wars to protect their own people. Others believed they were sleeping giants who would intervene when the time was right. Now, that rumor became reality before their eyes. A single human warship had appeared from the void. Between the refugee fleet and the enemy, like a steel guardian, the Varkesh fleet immediately reacted. Their ships broke formation slightly, focusing their weapons on the new arrival. Their commanders barked orders in their harsh language, shocked but not afraid, at least not yet. They had faced many enemies before, and in their minds this was just another target. On the bridge of the Resolute, Commander Hale stood tall, looking at the battlefield on the main screen. The radar was filled with enemy signatures, red dots everywhere, and the blue blips of the refugee ships clustered tightly in the center. He had seen war zones before, but the sight of these damaged, helpless vessels surrounded by predators ignited something inside him. "This isn't a battlefield," he said quietly to his officers. "It's a slaughterhouse." His crew watched him, waiting for his command. The comms officer spoke. "Sir, enemy fleet has locked weapons on us." Hale didn't flinch. "Good," he replied calmly. "Let them see what we can do." He ordered the ship to move forward slowly, placing the Resolute directly between the refugees and the Varkesh. The massive vessel glided through space with the grace of something built for power. Not speed, its thick hull reflected the faint light, and its engines burned brightly, signaling to everyone present that it wasn't backing down. The refugees couldn't believe what they were seeing. Many crowded the observation decks, pressing their faces against the glass, watching the human warship position itself like a shield in front of them. Whispers spread through the ships. Humans. They came. Is it real? Are they here to help us? Hope, something that had been fading moment by moment, suddenly flickered back to life in their hearts. The Varkesh didn't wait long. They launched their first wave of missiles toward the human ship. Testing its defenses, bright streaks of light crossed the void. Heading straight for the Resolute inside the human ship, alarms went off, but the crew reacted with trained precision. "Point defense active," shouted the weapons officer. Small turrets along the hull rotated rapidly, firing streams of projectiles and lasers, shredding the incoming missiles before they could get close. The explosions lit up the darkness like fireworks, leaving trails of glowing debris. The enemy fleet paused again, recalculating their approach. They had expected the human ship to either retreat or struggle under the first attack, but neither happened. Instead, the Resolute moved forward another few hundred meters, its weapon systems locking onto multiple targets simultaneously. Commander Hale stood firm, his voice clear as he gave his next order. "Target their lead cruisers." The officers nodded, their fingers dancing across the control panels. A low, Powerful hum filled the ship as the railguns charged. Then, with a soundless flash, the first shots were fired. Hypervelocity slugs ripped through space, invisible to the naked eye until they struck their targets. 2 Varkesh cruisers exploded almost instantly, their armor torn apart like paper. The shockwave rippled through the enemy formation, their clean attack pattern breaking as they scrambled to react. On the refugee ships, cheers erupted, people shouted, cried, hugged each other. For the first time in weeks, they saw their enemy stumble. They watched in awe as the lone human warship faced an entire fleet without hesitation. The Varkesh regrouped, furious and surprised. But the balance had already shifted. The arrival of the Resolute was more than just reinforcements. It was a symbol, a message to both the refugees and their enemies that humanity had entered the fight. And they hadn't come to negotiate in that single moment. Everything changed. The refugees, who had accepted their fate moments earlier, now had a reason to believe they might survive. The enemy, once so sure of their victory, now faced a new and unexpected force. The silent void that had watched this desperate struggle was now alive with the roar of a human warship, emerging like a savior from the darkness, ready to turn the tide of the battle. The enemy fleet recovered from its surprise quickly, and the calm of the void was replaced by the tense silence that comes before a full-scale attack. The Varkesh ships spread out, forming a new attack pattern, their weapons glowing brighter as they charged for a coordinated strike. They had underestimated the human warship once, but they would not make the same mistake again. Their commanders were ruthless and efficient, used to crushing weaker fleets with overwhelming firepower. Now their entire formation focused on a single target, the UNS Resolute. Inside the Resolute, Commander Hale stood on the bridge, watching the tactical screen light up with hundreds of red markers. The enemy ships were moving into attack positions, launching waves of fighters and missiles. The situation was dangerous, but Hale's eyes were steady, his voice calm. "Targeting solutions," he said, and his crew responded immediately. The bridge was alive with movement, officers tapping on consoles, engineers shouting updates, radar operators calling out enemy movements. They had trained for moments like this, and now their preparation would be tested. "Lock railguns on the front line," Hale ordered. Missiles on the flankers, drones on intercept. Within seconds, the ship's massive weapon systems came alive. Along the hull, the railgun barrels rotated into position, each one capable of firing projectiles at near light speed. Missile launchers slid open, revealing rows of deadly payloads, and swarms of small combat drones launched into space like a cloud of shining insects. They moved with precise coordination, forming a protective screen around the ship, ready to intercept enemy fighters. The first wave of Varkesh missiles streaked through the darkness, leaving long trails of burning light behind them. The point defense systems on the Resolute activated automatically, spinning and firing in every direction. Lasers and kinetic projectiles filled the space around the ship, creating a deadly shield that tore through the incoming missiles one after another. Explosions flashed around the vessel like fireworks, shaking the refugee ships that watched from behind. But none of the missiles got through, not a single one. Then it was the human ship's turn to strike. Hale gave the order without hesitation. "Fire!" The railguns fired almost silently, but their effect was anything but quiet. The slugs ripped through the void and slammed into the lead Varkesh cruisers with unimaginable force. Their shields flared briefly, then shattered, and the projectiles punched straight through their armored hulls. 2 cruisers broke apart instantly, pieces of burning metal spinning away like shrapnel. The missile launchers followed, releasing swarms of guided projectiles that arced gracefully around the battlefield. They didn't move in straight lines like the Varkesh missiles. They danced through space, adjusting their paths to avoid enemy defenses when they struck. They struck hard. Explosions bloomed across the enemy flanks as several smaller ships were blown apart or disabled in seconds. The Varkesh formation faltered, gaps opening where their ships had been destroyed. The refugee fleet watched in disbelief from their viewports. They saw the human ship fighting like something out of legend. It wasn't just surviving. It was controlling the battle. Their enemies, who had been unstoppable for weeks, were suddenly on the defensive, struggling to adapt to the precision and power of human technology. The Varkesh responded with fury, launching a second, much larger wave. Their fighters swarmed forward like a dark cloud, hundreds of them moving together, weaving through the debris of their fallen ships behind them. Heavy artillery cruisers charged their main cannons, Preparing to unleash a devastating volley meant to overwhelm the Resolute's defenses. Commander Hale saw the incoming wave and didn't hesitate. "Deploy counter-drones," he ordered. "All railguns focus on heavy cruisers. Don't let them fire." The drone swarms moved out, meeting the Varkesh fighters head-on. The small machines zipped and twisted through space with incredible speed, firing streams of light projectiles. They didn't fight in tight formations like the enemy. They adapted, broke apart, and attacked from every angle. The enemy fighters were faster, but the drones were smarter, using coordinated AI maneuvers to trap and destroy their opponents. The sky between the fleets turned into a glowing storm of explosions and tracer fire. Meanwhile, the Resolute's railguns targeted the heavy cruisers. Their shots tore through the darkness like invisible spears, hitting the cruisers just as they tried to fire. One cruiser exploded before it could release its volley. Another spun out of control, venting fire and debris into space. The third managed to get off a shot, a massive energy beam that slammed into the Resolute's shields. The entire ship shook violently. Lights flickered and several consoles sparked. But the shields held. "Status," Hale barked, and the tactical officer replied, "Shields at 73%, holding steady." Hale nodded sharply. "Then hit them harder." The missile batteries reloaded and fired again, targeting the remaining cruisers. More explosions lit up the battlefield as the Varkesh lost ship after ship, their perfect formation collapsing into chaos. The refugees couldn't believe what they were seeing. On the Celerith, officers stood frozen, staring at the display screens as the human ship dismantled the enemy with calm, deadly precision. Some of them began to cheer quietly. Others cried openly, the sound of hope slowly replacing the silence of fear. For weeks they had run and hidden, watching their fleets burn one by one. Now, for the first time, their enemy was the one falling apart. But the battle was not over. The Varkesh were proud and fierce, and even as their ships exploded around them, they continued to press forward. Their remaining cruisers formed a desperate line, trying to flank the human ship and reach the refugee vessels behind it. Hale anticipated the move, giving quick, precise orders: turn starboard, bring the dorsal railguns to bear, cover the flank. The Resolute pivoted with surprising grace for a ship its size, blocking the enemy's path. The next volley from the railguns ripped through the flanking ships, shattering their maneuver. Every move the enemy made was countered. Every attack turned back on them. Commander Hale didn't just fight. He commanded the battlefield like a chess master, turning what should have been overwhelming odds into a controlled engagement. One by one, the enemy ships began to retreat slightly, trying to regroup. They had expected an easy kill, but instead, they were bleeding ships at an alarming rate. The human warship stood alone, surrounded by debris and fire. Still holding strong, its guns kept firing, its drones kept pushing forward, and its missiles hunted down enemy targets with relentless precision. For the refugees watching from behind, it was like seeing a myth unfold before their eyes. They had believed no one could stand against the Varkesh fleet, but a single human ship was proving them wrong. The counterattack had not only stopped the enemy advance, it had broken their momentum completely. The tide of the battle was beginning to turn, and for the first time in a long while, the refugees allowed themselves to believe they might live to see another sunrise among the stars. The battlefield had changed completely. Only minutes earlier, the refugee fleet had been surrounded and waiting for death, their ships drifting like wounded birds in the cold dark. Now, the UNS Resolute stood between them and the enemy like an unbreakable wall, its weapons flashing across the void, its drones filling the sky like a swarm of bright stars. The Varkesh attack had been fierce, but their perfect formation was broken, their confidence shaken, and their lines scattered by the precise human counterattack. Commander Hale watched the tactical display carefully. Every movement of enemy ships tracked in real time. He could see their hesitation, the tiny adjustments in their formations that revealed doubt. For a fleet like the Varkesh, which relied on fear and overwhelming power, hesitation was dangerous. "Press the advantage," Hale ordered, his voice calm but sharp. "Move forward 50 meters, keep the formation tight, and give the refugees room to reorganize." The massive human ship slowly advanced, pushing deeper into the battlefield, its engines burning bright against the blackness. Behind the Resolute, the refugee ships began to move again. For so long they had been running, retreating, hiding, they had forgotten what it felt like to push forward. Now, with the human warship taking the lead, their captains began to follow its example. Broken engines were pushed to their limits. Shields were redirected to the front, and crews scrambled to get damaged systems online. The Cellarith, though battered, moved back into a central position, acting as a command hub for the other vessels. Captain Sorrell gave crisp orders over the coalition comms. Follow the human ship's lead, keep your formation tight, match their movements. Her voice carried a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. The human ship began to act not just as a fighter, but as a shield and a leader. Its powerful electronic countermeasures scrambled the Varkesh targeting systems, creating interference that made it harder for the enemy to lock onto the weaker refugee ships. Drones spread out to form protective corridors, intercepting any missiles that tried to slip through toward the civilians. Whenever the enemy tried to flank, the Resolute rotated smoothly, its railguns and missile pods firing with precision to block their path. The refugees watched this coordination with awe. Their ships were old and not designed for war, but under the direction of the human vessel, they started to function like part of a single united fleet. Transport captains who had spent weeks in panic now followed calm. Clear instructions. Medical ships moved behind the Cellarith, shielded by the Resolute's bulk. Even the smallest freighters joined the formation, their crews rerouting every bit of power they could spare to shields to survive the crossfire. The Varkesh realized what was happening and tried to regain control. Their commanders ordered a concentrated attack on the Resolute. Hoping to break the shield and scatter the refugees again, dozens of ships turned their weapons on the human vessel, unleashing beams, missiles, and plasma bursts all at once. The void filled with light and fire as the barrage slammed into the human shields. The ship shook violently, alarms blared, and sparks flew across the bridge. But the hull held firm. Shields at 60%, shouted the tactical officer. Hale nodded calmly. Hold the line, he replied in the engineering bay. Chief Brooks and his team worked frantically. They rerouted power from non-essential systems, dimming lights and shutting down secondary modules to feed more energy into the shields. Sweat dripped down their faces as they tightened bolts, replaced overheated cables, and stabilized the reactor. Keep it steady, Brooks yelled over the noise. We're not letting them crack us. Their hard work paid off. The shield fluctuations evened out, and the ship stayed firmly in position. Then the Resolute struck back. While the enemy focused on overwhelming the shields, the railguns and missile systems continued to fire methodically, targeting enemy cruisers one by one. Each shot from the railguns hit with brutal accuracy, piercing through hulls and detonating reactors. Missiles weaved through the chaos, striking critical weak points on the Varkesh ships, causing chain reactions of explosions one by one. The enemy's heavy hitters were silenced, their formation crumbling further with each loss. The refugees, inspired by the human ship's strength, began to assist in ways they could. Some freighters used their meager point defense systems to shoot down stray missiles aimed at the Resolute. Others deployed small repair drones to help patch damaged hulls of nearby ships, even though they didn't have real weapons. Their support actions made a difference for the first time. They weren't just survivors, they were part of the fight. Commander Hale noticed this shift and used it to his advantage. He sent out tactical signals through encrypted channels, giving the coalition ships simple, clear commands. Hold this line. Form up behind Sector 3. Stay tight. The refugees followed these instructions perfectly. It was as if the human ship's presence had unlocked something in them. They had been scattered prey before, but now they were part of a defensive wall. The Varkesh tried a new tactic. They pulled back their main fleet slightly, as if preparing for a retreat, then suddenly sent a fast strike group to the far left flank, hoping to break through and reach the refugee ships directly. But Hale anticipated the maneuver before it even fully formed on the radar. Rotate 30 degrees to port. Bring the dorsal railguns online, cut them off, he ordered. The Resolute moved like a predator, intercepting the flanking force before they could reach their targets. Railgun fire tore through the fast ships, destroying half of them instantly. The remaining ships scattered, their surprise attack completely neutralized. The refugees watching from their ships couldn't believe the precision with which the humans fought. They had seen many battles before, but never had they witnessed such control and discipline in the middle of chaos. Every movement of the Resolute was deliberate, every shot meaningful. It wasn't just a ship. It was a symbol, a force that stood between life and death. Slowly, the balance of the battle shifted. The Varkesh, once so sure of their victory, were now struggling to keep their fleet together. Their ships moved erratically, Trying to regroup under heavy fire, some began to retreat to safer positions. Others hesitated, unsure of whether to attack or flee. The refugees felt this shift deep in their hearts, a wave of relief mixing with adrenaline. For weeks, they had only known fear and despair, running from a powerful enemy with no hope of fighting back. Now, because of one human warship, the tide had turned. The Resolute didn't just protect them. It gave them a second chance, and as the battle raged on, every alien watching knew that something historic was happening before their eyes. A coalition of broken ships and one human vessel were standing together, turning the impossible into reality. The turning point had arrived, and the Varkesh were no longer the hunters. They were starting to become the hunted. The battlefield was filled with burning debris, broken ships, and flashes of light from ongoing skirmishes. What had started as a one-sided hunt had transformed into a fierce, coordinated defense with the UNS Resolute leading the charge. The Varkesh fleet, once confident and unstoppable, now moved with hesitation, their lines broken and their ships scattered. They were not used to resistance like this, especially not from a single warship standing against their entire force. Inside the Resolute, Commander Hale watched the tactical map closely, his sharp eyes following every shift in the enemy formation. He could see the signs that every experienced commander recognizes: hesitation, disorganization, and the early movements of retreat. The enemy flagship had pulled back slightly, its escorts tightening their defenses, which meant their commander was preparing for a withdrawal. Hale leaned forward slightly and spoke clearly. "This is it. They're breaking," the tactical officer confirmed. "Enemy cruisers on the far flank are pulling out of formation. Their fighter wings are retreating." Hale didn't waste time. "Maintain pressure on their flagship. Don't let them regroup," he ordered. Railguns rotated with a mechanical hum, locking onto the lead Varkesh vessels, and the missile batteries prepared their next volley. The human ship didn't slow down. It pushed forward like a spear through a fragile shield, shattering whatever defense the enemy tried to build. The Varkesh fought back with desperation, not strategy. Their remaining ships launched scattered attacks, firing wildly, trying to hit something, anything, to stop the human advance. But desperation was no match for discipline. The Resolute intercepted their fire with precise countermeasures. Drones destroyed incoming missiles mid-flight, and the railguns fired with deadly accuracy. One enemy ship after another was either destroyed or forced to retreat in flames. Among the refugee fleet, a new kind of energy was spreading, hope mixed with astonishment. For weeks, these aliens had lived under the shadow of the Varkesh, always fleeing, always outmatched, always waiting for the inevitable end. Now, they were witnessing something they had never imagined. The Varkesh turning their ships around and retreating. On the Celerith, the bridge crew stared at their screens. Unable to believe what they were seeing, a young officer whispered, They're running," his voice trembling as if saying it might break the spell. Another officer laughed suddenly, the sound raw and full of disbelief. "They're actually running." Across the refugee ships, cheers began to erupt. People who had been hiding in dark corridors ran to viewports, staring at the battlefield as the once terrifying enemy pulled back. Pilots who had been prepared to sacrifice themselves for a few more minutes of survival now found themselves chasing retreating fighters. The change was emotional and overwhelming, like a sudden sunrise after a long and endless night. The enemy flagship attempted to regroup one last time, pulling its remaining cruisers into a defensive wall. But the Resolute wasn't going to give them the chance. Commander Hale pointed at the screen. "Target the flagship. Full power to forward weapons." The ship's systems responded instantly. The railguns charged, the missile bays opened, and drones cleared a path. The volley that followed was devastating. Hypervelocity slugs ripped through the enemy escorts. Breaking their wall apart like glass, missiles swarmed in from multiple angles, hitting the flagship's shield generators simultaneously. The massive enemy vessel shuddered under the impact, bright explosions flaring across its hull. Its once powerful shields flickered and collapsed, leaving its armored body exposed. The next railgun salvo punched straight through its center, splitting decks and igniting secondary explosions. The enemy flagship began to drift, its engines failing, a dark cloud of burning metal spreading around it. The destruction of their flagship broke the morale of the Varkesh completely. Their formation disintegrated as captains ordered emergency retreats, engines flaring as they jumped to hyperspace one by one. Some smaller ships tried to stay and fight, either too proud or too slow to escape. but they were quickly overwhelmed and destroyed within minutes. The battlefield that had been full of enemy ships was emptying rapidly, leaving behind wreckage and silence. The refugees watched as their hunters fled, their fear replaced by an emotion they hadn't felt in a long time: triumph. On the Cellarith, Captain Sorrel closed her eyes for a moment, letting out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Then she opened her eyes and gave the order to broadcast a message across the fleet. Her voice carried through every ship, clear and strong. "They're retreating. The enemy is in full retreat." The reaction was explosive on medical ships. Wounded soldiers raised their fists weakly. On freighters, families hugged each other and cried. On smaller transports, pilots shouted with joy through their comms. Unable to believe they had survived, the sound of relief and celebration filled the channels, overlapping into a single chorus of victory. Meanwhile, on the Resolute, the crew didn't celebrate right away. They stayed focused, tracking the retreating ships to make sure no surprise attacks were waiting. Hale stood silently for a moment, watching the enemy disappear into hyperspace. He knew the battle was won, but he also knew this was only the beginning. Humanity had just announced its presence in this war, and the Varkesh would not forget. The comms officer turned to Hale. "Sir, incoming transmission from the Cellarith." "Put it through," he replied. Captain Sorrel's face appeared on the screen, tired but glowing with gratitude. "Commander Hale," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "On behalf of every soul in this fleet, thank you." Hale gave a small nod. "You're not alone anymore," he said simply. That short sentence spread quickly across the refugee fleet, repeated over and over. For so long they had felt abandoned, isolated in a dark corner of the galaxy with no one to come to their aid. But now a single human warship had turned the tide, stood against a powerful enemy, and saved them when no one else could. The battlefield slowly quieted as the last enemy ships jumped away. Leaving behind only debris and the faint glow of wreckage, repair crews moved quickly. Drones flying out to help stabilize damaged refugee vessels. Medical teams transferred wounded between ships, and engineers began patching holes in their hulls. The refugees were exhausted, battered and grieving their losses, but they were alive. They had survived something they never thought they would. The retreat of the Varkesh was more than just a tactical victory. It was a turning point. A moment that every person in that fleet would remember for the rest of their lives. They had seen an enemy flee, seen the impossible happen, and they had witnessed the power of humanity emerge from the void like a storm. The Varkesh were gone, at least for now, and in their wake they left not despair, but a spark of hope that could not be extinguished anymore. The battle was over, but the silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm, heavy, emotional, and full of meaning. The battlefield around the Telleran system was scattered with debris from destroyed Varkesh ships, drifting slowly through space like dark, broken stars. The refugee fleet floated together in tight formation, their hulls damaged, shields weak, engines still struggling, but they were alive. For the first time in weeks, no enemy ships were chasing them, no alarms were blaring, and no one was preparing for death. They were safe, at least for now, on the UNS Resolute. Commander Hale stood on the bridge watching the tactical screen as the last traces of the enemy disappeared into hyperspace. He could finally let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly after hours of intense focus. Around him, the crew worked quickly to stabilize systems, reroute power, and scan for any hidden threats. But their movements carried a new energy. It wasn't the tight, tense urgency of battle anymore. It was the steady confidence of people who had achieved something extraordinary. They had faced an entire enemy fleet, and they had won in the engineering bay. Chief Brooks leaned back against a wall, wiping sweat and grease from his forehead. His team was exhausted but grinning widely, exchanging tired high fives and pats on the back. They had pushed the ship to its absolute limits, and it had held together. "You see that?" one of the younger engineers said, his voice full of excitement. "We actually did it." "We held the line," Brooks laughed. "Damn right we did," he said proudly. "And we showed them what a human ship can do." Outside, small repair drones flew between the refugee ships, patching holes and stabilizing hulls. The Resolute deployed its own repair teams to assist the coalition fleet, sending engineers, medical supplies, and food to the most damaged vessels. On some of the refugee ships, power had completely failed during the battle, and they were now dark and drifting. Human crews docked with these ships, bringing them emergency power modules and helping them restart their systems. For many of the refugees, it was the first time they had ever seen humans up close. They expected cold military faces, but instead they found friendly, determined people ready to help without asking for anything in return. On the Solarith, Captain Serral stood on the bridge, surrounded by tired officers. Her usually stern face softened as she watched human teams working alongside her people. Messages from ships across the fleet came in. Words of thanks, disbelief, relief, and joy. Many of them repeated a single phrase they had heard earlier: "You're not alone anymore." The refugees had lived in fear for so long that they had almost forgotten what hope felt like. Now, as they watched the human ship in the distance, powerful and steady, they realized their lives had changed forever. Later, a meeting was held between Commander Hale and the leaders of the refugee coalition. The Solarith hosted the gathering in its main council chamber, which had been hastily cleaned and repaired after the chaos of the battle. The holographic table that had once shown their hopeless situation now displayed a new image. The fleet, alive and whole. When Hale entered the room, the alien leaders stood in respect, something they did not do lightly. Velen, the insectoid council member who had once argued for a desperate charge, stepped forward, his tone humble. "Human Commander, your arrival saved us all. Without your ship, we would have been nothing but wreckage by now." Hale shook his head slightly. "You survived because you held together long enough for us to get here," he replied in his calm voice. "But we couldn't have done it without you," added Laura, the elderly amphibian leader, her eyes wet with emotion. "You gave us something we had lost, hope." The room fell silent for a moment as everyone absorbed those words. For weeks, these leaders had been forced to make impossible choices, sacrificing ships, abandoning worlds, carrying the weight of thousands of lives while feeling utterly alone, and then, out of nowhere, a single human warship had arrived and stood against their greatest enemy, changing everything. It didn't take long for discussions to turn toward the future. The refugees knew that the Varkesh would not simply forget this defeat. They would return, perhaps with an even larger fleet, determined to crush anyone who had dared to resist them. But now the refugees were not alone. Hale offered to escort their fleet to a secure human-controlled sector, where they could repair, regroup, and plan their next steps. More than that, he opened the door for something bigger: cooperation between humanity and the Talaran coalition. The Talaran Council debated briefly, but their decision was clear. They had lived too long without allies, and they had seen firsthand the strength and discipline of the human fleet. An agreement was reached, not just for temporary protection, but for a formal alliance. Humanity and the Talaran coalition would share intelligence, coordinate defenses, and stand together against the Varkesh threat. It was a historic moment, one that would shape the future of the galaxy. As the talks ended, the message was broadcast across both fleets. The humans and the refugees stood together now, united by a battle that none of them would ever forget. On every ship, cheers and celebrations broke out, not loud and chaotic like during the retreat, but warm and full of relief. Families hugged their children, soldiers shook hands with human engineers, pilots shared stories with drone operators. Two completely different groups had found each other in the darkness and chosen to stand side by side. Commander Hale returned to the bridge of the Resolute later that night. Staring out at the stars, he thought about how close this fleet had come to destruction, and how one small decision to follow a faint signal had changed the fate of thousands. He knew this wasn't the end, that more battles would come, but now they would not be fought alone. The dying Talaran star cast a faint glow over the fleet as it slowly began its journey toward safer space. The human warship led the way, its engines bright against the black void. In the hearts of everyone watching, from the smallest child on a refugee transport to the oldest council leader, one truth burned brightly. When all hope had been lost, when the darkness had almost swallowed them, something unexpected had emerged from the void. A single human ship had changed everything, and as the fleet moved forward together, they knew this was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter of unity, courage, and the promise that they would never again face the darkness alone.